Welcome back, friend. It's time to let the day slip away. Wherever you are, whatever has happened, you can let it go now, just for a little while. Tonight, we're going back in time. Not to a loud battle, not to a famous king, but to something much older and much softer. We're going to a place where the first people settled beside a river, where the land was flat and wet, and the air smelled like warm clay and wild grass, where life moved slowly and everything was new. This is where civilization truly began, not in a moment, not in a year, but in the slow footsteps of people looking for a better place to rest. So lie back, close your eyes if you like. Let me tell you the story of the very first footprints in the silt. The river that gave and took long ago, so long that there were no names for the days or months or years. There was a land shaped by rivers. Two wide rivers flowed down from the mountains. One was called the Tigris, the other the Euphrates. They moved like soft snakes across the earth, always changing their course, always carving new paths. They brought water, and with water came life. The land between them wasn't a jungle or a forest. It was flat, dry, and sometimes cracked like a broken bowl. But when the rivers overflowed, they left behind something special: rich, dark silt, soft soil, perfect for planting. The people who came here didn't have cities. They didn't even have villages. They came in small groups, walking slowly, following animals or stars, or just their own tired feet. They were looking for food. They were looking for water. But more than anything, they were looking for home. And when they reached the land between the rivers, some of them decided to stop. A fire, a circle, and a place to stay. No one built a city all at once. It started with one fire, then another, then a small circle of people sitting down together, warming their hands, roasting something small, and looking out into the night. They built huts out of what they had: reeds from the river, mud that dried hard in the sun, twine made from grasses and hair. There were no rulers, no walls, just people trying to stay warm, stay fed, and stay close. Their children played with pebbles and chased goats. The old ones told stories under the stars. And every day, someone went down to the river with a clay pot to fetch water. The air smelled like smoke, wet earth, and fish. It was simple. It was quiet. But it was the beginning of something new. What they left behind today, we call these early people obeyed people. But they didn't call themselves that. They didn't use names we'd recognize. They didn't leave behind golden crowns or mighty statues. Instead, they left behind softer things: bits of painted pottery, stone tools worn smooth from use, necklaces made of shells from faraway seas, tiny clay figures of women with wide hips and peaceful faces. They lived in small communities, maybe 20 people, maybe 50, sometimes more, sometimes less. They didn't build ziggurats or write down laws, but they made choices every day, quiet, careful choices that shaped the world around them. They dug small channels from the river to water their gardens. They planted wheat and barley. They kept sheep and goats, and sometimes pigs. And when someone died, they buried them with care, curled up gently, with beads or tools beside them. Even now, thousands of years later, you can feel the tenderness in those burials. They may have been the first to understand something we still know: that to stay in one place is a kind of love. Paths in the dust. As time passed, more people came to the river. Some followed game animals. Some came for reeds to make baskets. Some had heard, from someone who had heard, that there was a place where food grew without searching too hard. So they came, and they stayed. Little paths appeared in the dust. Paths from one hut to another. Paths to the river. Paths to fields of young green shoots. People began to share things: a pot of grain, a skin of water, a tool passed from hand to hand. At night, they told stories, some true, some not. The stars above them were the same stars we see now, but to them, each one had meaning: a guide, a guardian, a reminder. They didn't call themselves a civilization, but that's what they were becoming. Quietly, slowly, gently. You've come back to a quieter place, a place where time moves slowly, like water through reeds. You don't need to think about anything now. Let your shoulders fall. Let your breathing slow. The world outside can wait. Tonight, we return to the soft banks of two ancient rivers, to a time when people lived in homes made of mud and hope. They weren't castles or palaces. They were small, simple shelters, shaped by hand, warmed by fire, and filled with quiet life. So close your eyes, or just soften your gaze. Let the story drift gently into your mind like smoke rising from a hearth. We are going back to the first homes, the first safe places. Let's step inside. Walls that breathed in the earliest days of settled life. Homes were made from what the earth offered. People didn't have bricks the way we think of them now, but they had something just as strong, mud mixed with straw. They called it adobe. It was soft at first, sticky and heavy like dough. But when the sun dried it, it became hard, strong enough to last a season, sometimes many seasons. Walls were shaped by hand, not with rulers or blueprints, but with memory and instinct. Each handful pressed into place with care, sometimes by men, sometimes by women, sometimes with a child pressing in a clumsy, happy palm. The walls weren't perfect. They leaned, they cracked, but they stood, and within them, a family could sleep safely. That was everything. Inside, where life happened inside these homes, there was no glass, no metal, and no marble. Just earth. The floors were made of packed dirt, swept smooth each morning with a bundle of reeds. At the center, a hearth, a shallow bowl of baked clay, held the family's fire. A pot of grain might bubble softly there, sending up a warm, nutty smell. There were mats on the floor, woven from dried grasses, where people sat, ate, and slept. One room served all purposes. There were no closets, no doors on hinges, just hanging cloth or wooden screens. And in that single room, life unfolded. Babies were born, bread was baked, old stories were told, again and again, in whispers and yawns. Each home was small, but it was sacred. The courtyard of sunlight. Most homes opened onto a small courtyard, a sunny space where daily chores unfolded. Here, pots were left to dry, grain was sifted, linen was washed and hung on ropes between sticks. Children played with bits of pottery and smooth river stones. Chickens scratched in the dust. Goats watched from a shady corner. Cats came and went, following the scent of fish or mice. There was always something happening, but never in a hurry. A woman grinding grain might pause to watch a bird hop along the wall. A man tying reeds might stop to scratch his beard and gaze at a cloud. Even work had rhythm, a soft, repeating pace that felt like breathing. And when it was hot, too hot to move, people rested. They stretched out in the shade and let the afternoon pass without worry. Time, in these homes, was not something to chase. It simply unfolded. The quiet arts inside and outside the home. There were always little tasks, peaceful, skilled, and slow. Women spun flax into thread, pulling and twisting the fibers between their fingers. The thread would be dyed with crushed berries or roots, then woven into linen cloth on simple looms. The cloth was used for tunics, wraps, and blankets. Some painted pots with soft curves and lines. Others carved tiny stamps to press into clay, just for decoration, or maybe for a name. There was no market for these things yet. No one was selling. They were made to be used, to be gifted, to be shared. And each item carried a little warmth. A thumbprint in the clay, a crooked thread in the hem, signs of the hand that made it. The home was not just a shelter. It was a quiet workshop, a soft cradle for memory. Morning light. Let's imagine a single morning inside one of these homes. The sky is still pink, and a thin mist floats above the earth. The river murmurs in the distance, not loud, just present. Inside the hut, the coals from last night's fire still glow faintly. A woman rises quietly. She stirs the ashes, adds a few twigs, and soon a little flame is licking the clay again. A pot is placed on the fire, maybe millet or lentils. The smell is earthy and calm. Outside, her husband has already taken the goats out to graze near the river. They'll eat until the sun grows too hot, then come home on their own. Children wake slowly. One rubs his eyes. Another reaches for the leftover flatbread wrapped in cloth. No one speaks much yet. The day begins gently. It always does. Walls that held stories. These walls had no paint, but they were full of color. Some people pressed little designs into the mud as it dried, wavy lines, dots, or even thumbprints. Others hung bundles of dried flowers or herbs by the door. Inside, you might find a carving of a goddess, round, serene, watching over the hearth, or a faded handprint from a child now grown. There were no books yet, no writing on paper, but stories lived here. You could read them in the way the mat was worn or the pattern of pots on a shelf. Each home told a story, not of kings or battles, but of life. Quiet, everyday life. The kind that hums along, unnoticed, but deeply meaningful. Visitors and neighbors sometimes, a neighbor would come by. There were no locks, no bells, just a quiet greeting and the gift of presence. Maybe they came with fish to share. Maybe they came to ask for water or a new grinding stone. People helped one another, because in a land without stores or markets, neighbors were everything. A shared meal, a shared laugh, a shared silence. Homes weren't just for one family. They were part of a village web, a soft network of trust and closeness. When night fell at night, the world softened. The fire burned low. The children curled up, limbs tangled on sleeping mats. Goats huddled outside. Dogs dozed near the threshold. The woman leaned against the wall, her eyes half closed, listening to her husband hum an old tune. Not for performance, just for comfort. The moon cast silver light through the roof. Stars watched in silence. In that little mud home, there was no fear, only rest. And that rest passed from one home to another, across the village, and down through time. The man sat cross-legged on the floor, a small flat piece of clay resting in his lap. He held a thin reed in his hand, sharpened at one end, hollow in the middle. The morning was warm. A breeze drifted through the reed mat that served as his door. He squinted slightly, tilted the reed, and pressed it gently into the soft surface of the tablet. The mark it left was small, just a wedge, like a bird's footprint. But it meant something. It was a number. The first writing in the world didn't begin with poetry. It began with grain. How much barley had been given? How many goats had been lent? What had been promised? What had been received? The first writing was not for beauty or for love. It was for memory. Not the kind of memory that lives in stories. The kind that lives in lists. A woman brought a small jar of oil to the temple granary. She handed it to a quiet man sitting near a stack of empty clay tablets. He didn't speak. He simply took the oil, looked her in the eye, nodded once, and picked up his stylus. With calm hands, he pressed 3 symbols into the tablet. The mark for oil, the mark for one jar, and the symbol for her house. Then he set the tablet in a basket, and she went on her way. Clay didn't speak out loud, but it remembered. It remembered things people forgot. It remembered who owed what. It remembered what had been traded and when. It remembered who had visited and how much they paid. Each wedge, each line, each mark, silent, careful, and strong. These were not alphabets yet, not even full words, just symbols, pictographs. At first, they looked like tiny drawings. A jar looked like a jar. A fish looked like a fish. A man looked like a stick with a circle for a head. But over time, the pictures became simpler, more abstract. A fish no longer needed to look like a fish. It just needed to mean one. That was the beginning of something huge. But no one called it history then. They just called it useful. The clay came from the riverbanks. When it was dry, it was hard and pale and cracked. But when water touched it, it turned soft, like dough. People had always used it for bowls, pots, and bricks. But now they found another use. Writing. A wet slab of clay could be shaped, smoothed, and marked, then left to dry in the sun or hardened by fire. And just like that, it would hold words forever. There was no paper yet, no ink, just earth, and water, and time. In the back room of the temple, there were rows of shelves. No books, only tablets. Some were small, palm-sized, like skipping stones. Others were wide and flat, like dinner plates. Each held messages, agreements, counts, records of animals born, crops harvested, and taxes paid. Some were wrapped in clay envelopes, sealed with a thumbprint or a tiny carved stamp. A priest or scribe could pick one up, read the marks, and know exactly what had happened, weeks, months, or even years before. It was a memory made solid. The people who did this kind of work were called scribes. They trained for years, not with books, but by copying, one mark at a time. one row at a time, over and over again, on pieces of scrap clay, until their hands knew the symbols without thought. It was quiet work. There was no applause, no audience, just the soft scratch of reed on clay, and the warmth of sun-dried tablets resting in the shade. Not everyone could read these marks. Most people didn't need to, but everyone respected those who could. A scribe might sit at the edge of a market, waiting under a cloth canopy. People came to him with questions. "Write this down," they'd say. "My cousin owes me a basket of figs." Or, "Tell the granary I brought 6 jugs, not 5. The scribe would listen, nod, press the words into clay, and give the person a copy to keep. The clay was heavy. It didn't fold. It couldn't be hidden easily. But it was honest. If the marks were there, the story was true. Sometimes, a child would peek around the edge of the doorway, watching the scribe's work. The child had no stylus, just a finger, and he would press it into the mud beside the steps. Small dots, little shapes. His own kind of story. Even before he knew what the marks meant, he could feel their power. He could see how the adults respected them. He could sense that these lines mattered. And maybe, years later, he too would pick up a stylus and learn to make clay speak. A man came to the scribe with a pot of honey. It was a gift, not for the scribe, but for the temple. The man bowed, placed the pot gently on the ground, and stepped back. The scribe said nothing. He picked up his clay tablet, moistened it slightly, and began to write. For marks. That was all. Honey. 1 pot. From the beekeeper. For the goddess. He set the tablet aside, and the pot was taken inside. Nothing more was said, but the moment had been captured. Not in memory, but in clay. These small moments, simple and quiet, were the true beginning of writing. Not for poetry, not for war, but for peace, for fairness, for truth. One day, the marks began to change. A clever scribe realized that some sounds could be written too. Not just things, but sounds. At first, only simple names. Then places. Then actions. The wedge marks began to form something new. Cuneiform. Wedges pointing up, down, left, and right. Pressed in neat rows. Like little birds sitting on a wire. The script was still young, but it had rhythm now. Music. And with music came story. A man sat by the fire. His beard was gray. His eyes were closed. Beside him, a clay tablet rested in his lap. It was not a ledger, not a record of goods or goats. It was a tale of a man who walked the earth alone, of gods who sent dreams, of a great flood. The marks were slow, careful, full of space. They weren't written in a rush. They were shaped like memories. The story wouldn't be read by many, but it would last, because the clay would not forget. There were hundreds of tablets now, piled in baskets, stacked in corners, lined up on low wooden shelves. Some were broken, some were cracked, some had been pressed so long ago the edges had worn smooth. But the marks inside remained, clear, strong, timeless. Even the wind, blowing softly across the riverbanks, could not erase them. Now, across the land, others wanted scribes. Kings, merchants, priests. Each wanted to keep a record. Each wanted to be remembered. And so the scribes worked. By lamplight, by firelight, by the soft glow of the rising sun. They filled clay with meaning. And when they were done, they set the tablets to dry. They turned to dust on their fingers. But the words stayed. The invention of writing was not loud. It was not sudden. It came like water soaking into earth, like sunlight creeping across a floor. One small mark at a time, pressed by hand, made from clay, held in memory. And in that quiet, dusty room at the edge of the temple, clay began to speak. The ground was flat, and the sky was wide. The river curved quietly nearby, sometimes close, sometimes far, always moving. And the people, who had once lived in scattered huts along the edges of streams, began to gather in larger groups. It didn't happen suddenly. No trumpet called them. No wall was built overnight. They simply noticed there was safety in numbers, ease in sharing, comfort in closeness. So the clusters of homes grew closer. One family built beside another. One courtyard opened near the next. They shared wells, shared fields, and shared stories. And slowly, those small villages began to look like something new. A town. There were still reed houses and clay walls. still baskets of grain and goats in yards. But now, there were paths between homes, paths worn smooth by feet. And where the paths met, people stopped and talked. They exchanged food, tools, and news. They made plans. They smiled. At some point, a reed mat was laid down to display goods. Fish, onions, dates. The next day, someone else did the same. Then another. Soon, there was a market, not designed, just grown. People came not just to trade, but to linger, to talk, to watch, to laugh. It became a rhythm. After the fields, before supper, a stroll to the market. A routine that felt right. One of the first places this happened was a town called Eridu. Eridu sat near where the rivers met the sea. The water there was brackish, half sweet, half salt. The air smelled of mud, fish, and warm reeds. Boats floated gently at the edges, tied with rope to wooden stakes. At its center, Eridu had a temple. It wasn't tall at first, just a raised platform with a room for offerings. Clay bowls, grains, a little oil. But it was important, not for its size, but for what it meant. It meant there was a center, a place to face, a place to agree on, a place where the sky touched the earth. The people brought what they had to the temple, not just goods, but time. A man mended its walls. A woman brought flowers. A child left a carved bird on a flat stone. It was everyone's place, and yet it belonged to no one. In time, Eridu grew. New homes were built, this time with small storage rooms. Families began to dig deeper wells. They laid clay drains to move waste away from the paths. The markets widened. The temple rose another level. They didn't call it a city. They just called it home. To the north, another place was stirring. It was called Uruk. Uruk grew not by the river's edge, but near its many branches. The fields around it were good for barley, tall, golden stalks that danced in the wind. Goats grazed on the hills nearby. Birds circled above. Uruk, too, began with houses. But soon there were more than houses. There were kilns, low-domed ovens where clay was fired into hard shapes. There were pits for fermenting dates into drink. There were workshops for shaping copper, though it was still rare. There were more people here, more voices, more feet, more needs. So the streets were shaped, wider here, narrower there. Gates were placed at edges, wells dug deeper. Markets became daily, and the temple, in the center, grew higher. Each layer built on the one before, like a wedding cake of stone and clay. Painted bricks lined the top. White, red, black, the colors of earth and fire. From the top of that temple, a person could see far. Fields to the east, marshes to the south, dust trails where shepherds walked, smoke from morning fires in distant huts. This was not just a village anymore. It was a city. With more people came more roles. There were the farmers, with dirt on their feet and sun in their eyes. The potters, whose fingers always smelled like wet clay. The weavers, whose homes hummed with the rhythm of thread. The fishers, silent in the shallows at dawn. Then came the ones who counted, who wrote it, who weighed and watched. They kept track of barley, goats, and dates, of water given, of bricks delivered, of who was owed what. They carried tablets in baskets, styluses in their belts. Their robes were simple, but they walked with care. They were the early administrators, quiet, practical, and calm. No one ruled yet, not the way we think of kings. But someone had to make choices. Someone had to settle arguments. So there were elders, not loud, not feared, just respected. They sat beneath awnings, near the temple steps. People came to them not with gold, but with questions. She took my goat. No, it was mine. It was promised. It was not. The elder would listen, nod, ask questions, and finally, speak a few slow words. No punishment, just decisions. Not harsh, just firm. This was justice before laws were written. It was simple, but it worked. In Uruk, someone built a wall. Not for war, there were no armies. But for marking the edge. For saying, this is where we live. The wall wasn't high, just tall enough to stand above. Children climbed it. Old men sat beside it, watching the plains. Inside the wall, the city grew. Not just in number, in feeling. There was now a rhythm to life. Dawn, work, market, meal, firelight, sleep. People spoke of the gods more now. not in fear, but in presence. The god of the river, the goddess of grain, the spirit of the wind that cooled the fields. They were not far away. They were here, woven into the dust, the clay, and the stars. Offerings were placed gently on altars, not to ask, just to thank you. A bundle of wheat, a carved stone, a bowl of water. There were no sermons, only silence. In Eridu, someone began to sing, not for others, not for a crowd, just a song to the fields. Soft, slow repeating, a lullaby for the barley, a chant to the canal. The woman's voice drifted across the morning. A child nearby hummed along. There were no instruments yet, only breathe, but it was enough. In the homes of Uruk, something new appeared. Windows, small holes in the walls, high up, to let in air and light. Not grand, not glassed, just circles shaped with care. And shelves, clay shelves pressed into the walls, holding bowls and lamps. The homes were changing, becoming smarter. Not bigger, but better. At the edge of the city, a man dug a new well. The water came up cool and sweet. He smiled, not because of riches, but because of ease. He would not have to walk so far now. His wife would not carry such heavy jars. His child could splash in the shade. This was wealth, measured not in coins, but in comfort. The goats had paths now. The people had paths too. And above them, the stars continued to wheel. In Eridu and Uruk, the people watched the stars. They noticed which ones rose before the floods, which ones came with heat, which ones brought wind. They marked these with symbols, not to predict, just to know. Knowledge was not power, it was peace. To understand meant to sleep more easily. At night, the cities quieted, the markets closed, the fires dimmed, the river hummed, and from a rooftop, someone looked up. They didn't know they were in the first city. They didn't know they were being remembered. They just breathed, and rested, and dreamed. There was a quiet clatter in the air, not sharp, just gentle, like pottery against wood, like voices that didn't shout but murmured. In the middle of the old city, where paths had once been just for walking, something had changed. The market had grown. At first, there were only a few mats on the ground, spread near the temple courtyard. A bundle of onions, a few pots of milk, small things, small trades. But then someone came with wool, not just the scratchy kind for rope, but soft, white wool that had been washed and carded. Beside her, a man brought finely painted bowls, baked just yesterday. The glaze still smelled faintly of smoke. And beside them both, another man offered dried fish tied with twine. A quiet, patient fisherman who said little, but always returned with something. Soon, the spaces between the mats grew smaller. A second row formed, then a third, then stalls, frames made of reeds and draped with cloth to block the sun. People came not only to sell, but to see, to watch the potter shape clay, to listen to the weaver hum, to breathe in the smell of lentils simmering in a wide bronze pan over fire. There was no money yet, but that didn't matter. The language was not coins. It was an exchange. One bundle of leeks for 2 handfuls of barley, a clay jar for a new pair of sandals, a small carved figure for a warm wool tunic. Sometimes they argued, but mostly they agreed, because it wasn't just about the trade. It was about the rhythm of it, the back and forth, the shared smile. The nod meant, yes, that is fair. One morning, a woman arrived from far away. Her hair was wrapped tightly in a striped cloth. Her donkey walked slowly behind her, baskets swaying from its sides. She laid out her cloth in the shade and opened one of the baskets. Inside, shiny black stones, smooth and heavy. Obsidian, volcanic glass, sharp, cold, and rare. She said little, but she didn't need to. A crowd gathered. Not to buy, not yet, just to look, to touch, to ask where it came from. From the north, she whispered, near the mountains. No one in Uruk had ever seen the mountains. But now, holding that stone in their hands, they felt closer to them. It was the first quiet sign of a larger world. Trade had existed before. People always exchanged. But something had changed. Now it was regular. Now it had rules. Now it had places. And now, things came from far away. A soft blue stone from the east. Sweet tree resin from the far south. Feathers from tall birds no one had ever seen. The traders didn't always explain. They just smiled. Sometimes they left again before nightfall. Sometimes they stayed a few days, sleeping under reed roofs, wrapped in cloaks that smelled of foreign smoke. And always, they left something behind. Not just goods, but questions. What else is out there? What other paths reach this place? What other hands shape pots? What other fires bake bread? Children wandered the market with wide eyes. One of them carried a little clay figure of a bull, his favorite toy. Another watched a man weave reeds into a basket shaped like a fish. He asked if he could try. The man smiled and nodded. He failed at first. The reeds bent the wrong way. But the man gently adjusted the boy's fingers. Twist here. Hold there. Later, the child showed his mother. It wasn't perfect, but it held shape, and she hung it on their wall with pride. As the sun moved across the sky, the colors of the market changed. In morning light, the stalls looked pale and soft. By noon, they glowed, red pottery, yellow cloth, and green herbs bundled in fresh twine. And in the evening, everything turned golden. Dust rose from tired feet. Lamps flickered to life. A woman stirred lentils in a copper pan over a charcoal fire. The smell drifted down the path, past goats, past a cart, past a group of boys tossing pebbles in a circle. An old man tapped on his drum, not to perform, just for the sound. A slow beat, a heartbeat. No one rushed. Even at its busiest, the market never shouted. There were markers now, sticks with tiny carvings in the clay beneath them, symbols for fish, grain, and fruit. Scribes came, sat nearby, and wrote small records, just in case. There were simple weights, shaped from stone and stored in woven baskets. A scale made of wood, 2 plates balanced on strings. If a deal was large, it was weighed, but many still trusted hands. A potter offered 6 bowls. The baker nodded and gave her a heavy flatbread and a sack of flour. No words needed, only trust. A man from the city of Nippur came one day. He brought jars sealed with wax and tied with rope. He untied one, gently peeled the wax, and lifted the lid. Inside, scented oil, thick and golden. People leaned in. Some recoiled. Some smiled. It smelled like no oil they had ever known. Rich and strange. A warmth that stayed in the nose. He traded one jar for a small silver bead, another for a spool of red-dyed thread. When he left the next day, someone whispered, "He'll come back." And he did. The paths that led into the city were wider now. Cart tracks grooved the earth. Footprints crisscrossed like stories told and retold. Donkeys paused to drink. Children ran beside strangers and waved. Even the animals sensed the rhythm. The goats bleated more when they passed through the market. The dogs sat and watched. The birds overhead circled the smell of dates and fish. The city was still small by today's standards, but it was growing. Not just in size, in awareness. They now knew what they hadn't known, and they waited to see what would come next. One evening, a man brought something wrapped in a thick cloth. He laid it down gently, slowly unwrapped it, and there, rows of small, pale shells, too soft to have come from the river nearby. Someone asked, "Where?" He smiled. "Farsi, 2 moons away." No one knew where that was, but they believed him. The shells were too fine, too delicate, and too different. He offered them one by one. A shell for a jug, a shell for 3 bowls, a shell for a flute, and then he left. The next day, a child wore one on a string around her neck. She said it made her sleep better. Not everything traded was useful. One boy carved small toys, birds, bulls, and fish, with crooked smiles. A girl shaped dolls from cloth and filled them with barley husk. Someone made tiny clay tablets with funny faces pressed into them. A potter began pressing animals into the bases of his bowls, just for fun. These were not necessities, but they mattered. They made people smile. And that, too, was something to trade. A new stall opened near the edge of the market. A man with thick eyebrows and wide hands sat behind it. He didn't sell food. He didn't sell pots. He sold stories. He had small clay tablets with riddles pressed into them. Tiny figures of gods and monsters. Little poems scratched in sharp lines. He told stories as he sat, sometimes loud, sometimes soft. And when someone gave him a basket of dates, he handed them a story in return. Later that week, another storyteller came. Then a third. By the next moon, There was a corner of the market just for stories. People didn't trade things. They traded attention. At night, the market emptied. The stalls were covered. The mats were rolled. The fires died down. But the smell lingered: sweet fruit, warm oil, damp clay. And the quiet clatter remained. In the dark, the wind moved gently through the city, past empty baskets, past footprints, past shadows. The market had grown, and with it, the city's heart. Because trade wasn't just about objects. It was about contact. And when people touched, gently, respectfully, they grew closer. Even if they spoke different tongues. Even if they came from different paths. In the beginning, no one was called king. There were elders, yes. Scribes, priests, people whose words carried weight. But no one sat above all others. Decisions were shared, slowly and carefully. In the temple courtyard, beside a well, on a mat under the shade of a date palm. One man might settle a dispute about goats. Another might help organize the barley harvest. Another might remind the people of the old ways when a storm broke too early. Respect wasn't taken. It was given. And for many years, this was enough. But the cities were growing. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur. They were no longer just clusters of reed houses. They had walls. They had temples with stairs that touched the sky. They had scribes who wrote everything down. And they had problems. New ones. A canal needed repair before the next flood. A nearby village sent word. Their traders had been robbed. A shepherd's stolen sheep had turned into a shouting match between 10 families. The elders listened. They spoke. But sometimes it wasn't enough. Someone needed to decide quickly. Someone needed to carry the voice of the city. So they chose one. Not with a crown. Not with a drum roll. Just with a nod. Let him speak. And he did. He didn't call himself a king. Not yet. He was a coordinator. A protector. A servant of the temple. He kept order. He resolved disputes. He planned the storage of grain before a long summer. People brought him gifts. Not gold. There was little of that. But things of value. A carved bowl. A painted jar. A soft wool cloak. Not because he demanded it. Because they wanted him to remember them. To protect them. To know their names when he made decisions. And so, a leader was born. At first, he lived like everyone else. A simple house. A place at the edge of the temple. But then more people came. More disputes. More questions. More gifts. And his house grew. Wider. Taller. With a shaded porch where people waited to speak with him. 2 boys were hired to sweep the path. A girl poured water for guests. Another kept a record of the visitors. It wasn't a palace. But it was no longer just a house. One season, a nearby village sent word of bandits. A caravan had been attacked. The leader listened, then called on several men from the city. He gave them spears and cloaks, sent them with donkeys and water skins. They returned 5 days later with the stolen goods. And a message: we are not alone. People heard of this. They whispered. They nodded. They felt safer. And they began to call him by a new word. Lugal. It meant a lot, man. Strong man. But over time, it meant more. It meant leader. Ruler. King. He did not ask for a throne. But one was built. Of wood. Carved and smooth. Painted with bright red and black. He did not write laws. But his judgments were remembered. Scribed onto tablets. Passed from one family to the next. He did not wear a crown. But he wore a headband of woven wool, dyed with indigo. People bowed their heads when he passed. And the market quieted when he arrived. Not out of fear. Out of respect. Not all kings were kind. But the first ones were not tyrants. They were needed. Not wanted. They stepped forward when asked. And sat back when the reins were good. Their power was not in shouting. But in silence. People listened when they spoke. Because they rarely did. One king in Uruk began a new custom. He had a tablet made each year. It listed the harvest. The floods. The good and the bad. He called it the year stone. It was not made of stone at all. Just clay. But it lasted. Another copied him. Then another. Soon, each city had its own way of remembering. Its own calendar. Its own tablet. And history, once told only by mouth, was now written. Year by year. Not because of kings, but because of what kings inspired. Order, memory, direction. There was still the temple. Still the gods. Still the moon and the stars. The king was not above them. He stood beside them. He offered gifts at the altar. He fasted before planting season. He led prayers when the river changed course. He was not a god. He was a man, but a man trusted to speak when others could not. In time, the houses of kings grew larger, with courtyards, walls, servants. In time, the king's children were trained to lead, to write, to judge, to wait. In time, the city grew around the palace, not just around the temple, but still, in the quiet of the night, the king walked barefoot to the temple steps. He knelt, whispered thanks, and returned home without a sound, because even the highest man remembered. He, too, was made of clay, and all things returned to dust. Before the words, there were marks, not like the ones spoken with breath, not sounds carried by voice, but shapes pressed into clay, not read aloud, but understood with eyes. At first, they were simple: a circle for grain, a triangle for a mountain, a wavy line for water. But even the simplest things, when used often enough, begin to speak. And so the city, quiet and slow, began to write. It began with counting. The potter delivered 12 bowls. The man with the goats had 7 hides to offer. The baker traded 20 flatbreads each morning. People began to keep track. Not in memory, memory faded, but in clay. They rolled a small ball of wet clay between their hands, pressed a smooth stone flat, and then, with a sharp reed, they drew. A bowl for bowls, a line for 1, 2 lines for 2, 3 lines for 3. The reed left little grooves, soft at first, but once dried in the sun, those marks stayed, and the people felt something change. It wasn't just that they remembered more. It was that they remembered together. Near the temple, a small shaded room was set aside. Clay tablets lined the shelves, some flat, some rolled into little tubes, some square, some are shaped like leaves. This was the house of scribes, quiet people with nimble fingers, not rich, not loud, but powerful in a soft way, because they could make things last. A goat's weight, a field size, the date the flood began, and slowly, their symbols grew, from numbers to names, from objects to actions, from trades to stories. One symbol could mean bread. 2 together might mean giving bread. 3 might tell who gave it. The city was beginning to speak with its hands. A child wandered into the scribe's room one morning, not to cause trouble, just to see. She watched as a man dipped his reed into a tiny bowl of water, touched the clay with care, drew slow, careful lines. She asked, "What does it say?" He smiled, showed her the tablet. 3 signs, 1 for sheep, 1 for 1 for safe. The sheep came back, he said. She nodded. The next day, she returned, this time with her own ball of clay. He handed her a dull reed. She pressed it into the clay, not perfectly, but with meaning. Her first sentence, not spoken, written. Over time, the scribes invented shortcuts. A mark here meant 100. Another meant yesterday. Another meant barely ready to grind. They didn't write everything, just what mattered. And not everyone could read them, but those who could carried something silent and strong. They were the keepers of memory. The city was changing. Walls had been built. Markets expanded. Leaders chosen. And now, it remembered its own story. On tablets lined in rows. On tablets buried in walls. On tablets hidden in baskets. Each one is small, but together, they were vast. A trader came from the west, carrying a box of copper. He handed it to the man at the gate. The man took a tablet, pressed a mark, nodded. The trader asked, "How do you know what that means?" The man smiled. "Because I was taught." "Who taught you?" "My mother." The trader laughed. "And who taught her?" The man pointed to the temple. "The stars, the floods, the scribes, everyone." And the trader nodded, because the answer was true. In the cool hours before dawn, scribes lit their little oil lamps. They sat cross-legged, clay in lap, pressed the reed again and again, quiet as birds, still as stone. And in those marks, the city breathed. It told what it had seen, what it had done, what it had hoped. Not all the tablets were useful. One had only pictures of fish. Another listed every kind of tree. Another simply said, "The river laughed." Not because it had to, because someone wanted it to. And so writing became more than numbers, more than trade. It became a memory and dream. An art. The river that counted time before the people had calendars, before the months had names, and before years were counted. There was only the river. It flowed softly past their homes. It curled around their fields. It gave them water and sometimes took it away. And they watched. Every day, the elders watched its color. The children watched its edge. The farmers watched the reeds that grew along it, noting when they turned from green to gold. The river was their clock, but it did not tick. It whispered. When the water rose, it meant the snow far away had melted. When it fell, it meant the dry time had come. People marked these changes, not with ink, not with numbers, but with memory. The flood came after the star with the long tail. The fish swam deeper after the fifth full moon. The reeds broke when the clay was softest. They remembered these things the way people remember smells or sounds, or the way the air feels just before it rains. And little by little, they began to give names. One man tied reeds together into a loop. Each day, he added a pebble. When the loop was full, he started a new one. He called this a moon. Another used marks on the temple wall, shadows cast by the midday sun. He scratched a line each day. Soon, there were 30. This is a good length for waiting, he said. Others agreed. So they called it a month. The scribes wrote month of the new barley, month of the low river, and month of the cold sky. They wrote it beside trades, beside births, and beside blessings. They were not months as we know them today, but they were real. They were felt. They were seen in the sky and heard in the frogs. One woman began to keep a clay tablet. She drew a small shape each time the moon changed. Thin sliver, full circle, broken edge. 29 shapes later, she began again. The tablet became round, a wheel of time. She placed it on her shelf, beside the figures of her ancestors. She told her daughter, when this moon comes again, we plant. When this one returns, we rest. And her daughter listened, and one day passed it on. In the square, a young boy asked, "Why is the day shorter now?" The baker smiled, "Because the sun is tired. It will sleep longer now." The boy laughed, then asked again, more seriously. A priest nearby heard them. He brought a stick, stuck it in the dirt, waited. The shadow moved. Slowly, he placed stones at each place the shadow stopped. By evening, the boy saw the arc. He saw how the shadow had shrunk from the day before. "The sun isn't tired," the boy said. "It's just going lower." The priest nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "And when it rises high again, the fish will return." The temple built a tower, not to reach the gods, but to reach the stars. Each night, a quiet man climbed to its top. He watched the sky. He counted. There was a star that came before the flood. There was a cluster that marked the cold. He scratched symbols onto wet clay, not to make laws, just to keep time. He did not speak of the future, but he made it easier to wait for it. Farmers gathered by the riverbank. They pressed their feet into the mud, felt its softness. Now, one said, and they began to plant. They did not need a bell, or a decree, or even a date. They had the river, and it had spoken. Scribes wrote on tablets that said, "Grain planted on the second shadow after the flood. Goats born during the seventh moon." Children played games using circles drawn in the dirt. Each circle meant a day. They moved pebbles across them. A game, but also a lesson. They were learning to hold time in their hands. One morning, a trader arrived from far away. He carried a wooden disc with notches. He turned it slowly. "This is our calendar," he said. "It tells us when to harvest olives." The people of the city listened. They did not understand all of it, but they understood the idea. And slowly, they made their own. Not because they feared forgetting, but because they had more to remember. In a small home, a woman lit an oil lamp. She marked the clay beside her door, one mark for each sunset. She would do this until her child was born. It was not science. It was not prophecy. It was rhythm, and it helped her sleep. The roofs that listened to rain, there were nights when the rain came quietly. Not with thunder, not with wind, just with a soft tapping. It would begin somewhere in the distance, beyond the reeds, beyond the date palms, beyond even the farthest edge of the ziggurat steps. Then it would arrive, tapping on clay, dripping down woven reeds, falling into jars that had been left uncovered. And the people of the city listened. They didn't rush. They didn't hide. They sat beneath their roofs and let the rain speak. Because when it rained, life slowed. And when life slowed, people remembered. The homes in Uruk and Lagash were not made to be grand. They were made to hold warmth. Each one had a center room, sometimes round, sometimes square. The walls were clay, smoothed by hand. The roof was flat, made of mud and straw packed tight. A single oil lamp burned. A few pots hung from the wall. A mat for sitting, another for sleeping. That was enough, because home wasn't measured by size. It was measured by peace. A mother rose early, before the rain. She stirred lentils in a clay pot. She laid out clothes for her daughter. She swept the floor with a bundle of date palm twigs. When the first drops fell, she paused. She touched the roof, felt it dampen. She whispered to the clay walls, "It is a good day for staying in." And the walls, though they did not speak, agreed. Children gathered near the open doorway. They reached out their hands, letting droplets kiss their fingers. One boy caught a drop on his tongue. He giggled. His sister scolded him, then tried it herself. The rain was not heavy. It was steady. It made puddles in the packed dirt street. It made tiny rivers that flowed between houses. The older children made little boats from leaves. They watched them float past baskets and sandals. Some disappeared into cracks. Some reached the city canal. And all of it, every drop, every ripple, was noticed. Because life was quieter when it rained. And quietness makes space for wonder. Inside one home, an old man sat on a low stool. He carved small lines into a dry clay tablet. Not because he had to, because the rhythm of the rain helped him think. He drew a fish, then a bull, then a line to join them. He smiled. He remembered a story his father told him, about a fish that gave itself to feed a hungry god. He etched a few more marks, then placed the tablet on the shelf beside the others. The rain tapped above, and he closed his eyes. The roofs were flat for a reason. On dry days, people sat there. They dried dates. They combed wool. They told stories to the stars. On rainy days, they listened. The roofs caught the first drops. They softened the world. They reminded people to slow down. Some families set out pots to catch the rain, not because they lacked water, but because rainwater tasted different. It was wild and clean, and it had fallen from the same sky that watched over them. One girl collected the water in a small jar. She saved it beside her sleeping mat. She told her brother, "This water is from the clouds. I will use it when I feel sad." Her brother nodded, not teasing, because he understood. Even the animals grew quiet. The goats huddled under eaves. The chickens ruffled their feathers and settled. The donkey stood still, ears twitching gently. The rain fell on all of them equally. No one asked for it. No one controlled it. It was simply a guest, a welcome one. When the rain stopped, the air smelled sweet, like earth and ash and wet clay. People stepped out slowly. They picked up their baskets. They checked on their jars. They smiled at their neighbors. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. The world had been washed, and for a while, it would feel new. The meals that waited for sunset the sun in Mesopotamia did not rush. It took its time. It rose quietly and moved slowly across the sky, watching the city from above, until it lowered itself, little by little, behind the reeds and the rooftops. And as it fell, something else rose. The smell of bread, the sound of soft voices, the warmth of a clay pot pulled from the fire. Because when the sun sank low, the people ate. Not in haste, not in silence, but together. In every home, big or small, the evening meal was a quiet event. In a house with just one room, the mat would be unrolled. The bowl is set in the middle. A flatbread lay beside it. In a larger home, the family might sit in a square. Older ones cross-legged, younger ones on their knees. They didn't eat from plates. They didn't pass forks. They used fingers, dipped gently, carefully, never greedily, always with thought. The food was simple. Lentils, soft and seasoned. Stewed dates with barley. Goat's milk turned into thick, white yogurt. A slice of onion. A piece of cheese, wrapped in a leaf. Sometimes dried fish. Sometimes olives come from far away. Sometimes only bread, but always warm, and always shared. Before the meal, they gave thanks. Not loudly, not with long speeches, just a whispered word to the god of fields, or a glance toward the clay idol on the shelf, or silence, a moment of stillness, to remember the hands that had worked the field, the rain that had come, and the goat that had given milk. That was enough. The children always ate last, not because they were less important, but because they were watched. The elders smiled at their eagerness. The parents reminded them not to rush. One mother said, "The food tastes better when you eat it like the sun, slowly, gently, without burning." The children tried. Some succeeded, some forgot, but the meal still welcomed them. A girl once asked her grandfather, "Why do we wait for the sun to set?" He replied, "Because the world quiets down, and food listens better when there is less noise." She nodded. She didn't quite understand, but she remembered it. Years later, she said the same to her daughter, and her daughter nodded, too. In some homes, the meal was eaten under the open sky. They carried bowls to the rooftop, sat in the soft light of the evening, watched the stars appear one by one. They spoke of small things, a neighbor's new dog, a story from the market, a dream that had returned. Laughter came softly, like a breeze across the clay. It stayed for a while, then faded into the dark. After the meal, there was a stillness. No one jumped to clean. No one hurried to sleep. They sat. One man hummed a song he learned as a boy. A child traced circles in the dirt with a stick. A woman combed her sister's hair. The pot stayed unwashed a little longer, because the night was kind, and time could wait. In the temple, even the priests ate slowly. A table was laid with offerings first. Then the quiet ones came. Scribes, stoneworkers, singers. Each one took only what they needed. They did not speak of the gods. They did not speak of power. They spoke of bread. "This one is better than last week's. The barley was from the north. My brother taught me to stir it this way. The gods," they said, "listened best when people were fed." A visitor once asked, "Why do your people eat when the sun leaves?" A farmer replied, "Because the day feeds the land. The night feeds us." And the visitor understood, because some truths do not need long explanations. They only need a full bowl, a warm hand, and the quiet breath of evening. The walls that held their secrets, not every story was told in the streets. Not every word was meant for the temple. Some stories lived quietly, held between clay walls, whispered between sisters, folded into sleep. The city had its noise, its markets, its scribes, and its priests. But the homes had their stillness. And the walls, cool in the morning, warm by afternoon, listened more than anyone else. They kept the sides, the lullabies, the laughter that echoed low. They were not grand walls, not polished with gold, not painted with gods. They were hand-smoothed, built from straw and mud and care. And inside them, life unfolded slowly. In a home by the southern gate, a woman sat weaving. Her shuttle moved in a slow rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. She wasn't in a rush. Beside her, her mother sat, twisting thread from wool. And beside them, a toddler played with a clay figurine, missing its arms but precious nonetheless. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The loom made its own sound, like breathing. Outside, the sun beat on the street. But inside, it was cool, shaded, safe, and the walls held it all. In another home, a young couple argued. Softly, but clearly. They sat across from one another on the sleeping mat, the bowl of lentils between them, untouched. "You said you'd ask the elder," she whispered. "I did," he replied, eyes low. "And what did he say?" "That we wait, until the new barley comes." She exhaled slowly. It wasn't a loud fight, but the wall heard it, just like it had heard her prayers the night before. She had whispered them while grinding flour. She had whispered them while washing the bowls. And now the wall held those too. It didn't judge. It just remembered. Walls in Mesopotamia had many jobs. They blocked the heat. They supported the shelves. They marked the line between family and the rest of the world. But more than that, they wrapped around the softest parts of life. The secrets, like the small clay token hidden in the corner, from a cousin now far away, pressed with a symbol that only two people knew the meaning of, or the dried flour woven into the roof beams. A gift once, no longer bright, but still sacred. Or the crack by the sleeping mat, where a woman whispered her sorrows after her child was taken by fever. The walls did not forget. Even if the people moved away, even if new hands replastered them, the memories stayed inside the clay. Some walls bore marks, not decoration, but reminders. A line scratched for every moon past, a dot for each jar of lentils set aside. One wall bore a child's height, carved gently every season. Next to each mark, a name, a date, a hope. Another wall bore a secret, a small hollow, filled with 3 beads, a feather, and a folded reed. No one ever took them out, but no one covered them either. They belonged to the house now. At night, the walls listened to dreams. A woman murmuring in her sleep. A man turning over, whispering his father's name. A child waking, reaching for comfort in the dark. The walls didn't move, but they felt it all. The slow crack of warmth in winter, the cool sight of shade in summer. And they gave nothing away. The secret stayed. In one home, an old woman lived alone. She kept a jar of dried fruit beside her mat. She sang to herself as she swept. She spoke to the walls, told them her stories, asked them if they remembered the days when her husband's sandals still sat by the door. She touched the corner where her daughter once leaned. "You remember," she said. And the wall did. Not in words, not in thoughts, but in the way it stayed warm longer where her daughter used to sit. Homes did not last forever. Roofs crumbled. Floods came. New walls were built over old ones. But even buried, they remembered. When the archaeologists would one day dig, they'd find fingerprints pressed into the plaster, names etched in clay bricks, charcoal drawings of a bird, a star, and a face. They would study them, map them, try to understand them, but the truth would always be simpler. These were not messages for the future. They were just pieces of life, quiet ones, held safe by the walls. The door that was always open in the warm lands between the rivers, doors did not slam shut. They did not creak with locks. They stayed open, or if not open, they stayed soft. A reed curtain swayed in the wind. A mat lay gently over the threshold. People knew what it meant. You could knock, but you didn't have to. Because in the world of the first cities, you never knew who might need shelter. A traveler, a cousin, a trader with a tired animal, a woman with arms full of jars. And when they came, they were not turned away. In a quiet home near the canal, an old woman kept her door uncovered. Always. She lived alone now. Her children had their own walls. Her husband had returned to the dust, but her table still held 3 bowls. One for her, one for a neighbor if they dropped by, and one for the unexpected. Sometimes it was a boy from the temple school, too proud to ask, but too hungry to say no. Other times, a reed cutter who had been caught by the afternoon heat. Once, a stranger who spoke no known words. He pointed to the sky, to the river, then to his stomach. She handed him lentils. He bowed low, and when he left, she found a stone in the doorway, painted with the simplest sign of all, "Thank you." In the heart of the city, a merchant's home had a wide doorway, framed in baked brick, shaded by a woven awning. It opened into a courtyard, and that courtyard often smelled of cumin and stew. Travelers knew to stop there, not for trade, but for food. "You bring no silver?" the merchant would ask. "Good, then stay longer." He liked stories more than coins. He liked to know what the river was doing 5 villages down, what the stars looked like from a farther shore. In the evening, he would pass dates to his guests. "Tell me," he'd say, "what is bread called where you come from?" And the door stayed open as the sun dipped low. In the older quarter, a family had a saying, "A guest comes with dust and leaves with warmth." They lived simply. 2 mats, 1 roof, but they set aside a pot of water just inside the door, and a cloth to wipe the feet. The youngest daughter liked to guess where people came from. She looked at their sandals, their robes, their way of standing. "He's from the east," she whispered to her brother. "His belt is wide." The guest heard, smiled. "West," he said, and the whole room laughed. Hospitality was not a law. It was a rhythm, just like planting before the river rose, or sleeping when the moon was gone. You didn't question it. You just did it. Even the smallest homes had a spare piece of bread. Even the busiest homes paused for the thirsty. And even if the door was made of clay and cloth, it carried something greater than strength. It carried welcome. One morning, a traveler arrived in the rain. His cloak was soaked. His cart is broken. He knocked softly. A young boy opened the door, looked up. He looked back to his father. The father came, nodded, opened the door wider. They didn't ask who he was. Not yet. They just showed him where to sit, where to dry his hands, where to find warmth. His name came later. His story too. But first, shelter. Because in that world, doors were not just wood and cloth. They were promises. And the gods, it was said, walked like men, tested hearts. So every open door was also a prayer. Every shared bowl, a quiet hymn. You didn't know who you fed, but you knew why you fed them. Because once, someone had opened a door for you. And once, long before memory, someone opened the first door and let a stranger in. And the world grew softer because of it. The fields that grew with time, the soil did not ask for speed, that it asked for rhythm. And rhythm, in the first cities, was more sacred than gold. Long before tools had blades of bronze, before scribes pressed laws into clay, there was the field, flat, dark, open, waiting. Not everyone saw its beauty, but those who tended it did. Each year, the river gave a gift that it spilled over its banks with a slow sigh, covering the land in silt. Not mud, not water, something between the two, something soft and patient. The farmers watched. They didn't rush. They waited until the water returned home. Then, barefoot, they walked the field, pressing their toes into the damp earth, nodding. This was good. This would grow. They didn't own the land. They borrowed it from time, from the gods. And when they worked it, they spoke softly to the birds, not to frighten them, to the oxen, to guide them, to the earth, because it was listening, some sang. Low songs with no words, just sounds that matched the rhythm of digging, planting, waiting. The seed baskets were not full, but they were enough. One woman pressed barley into the earth with the tip of her finger. One by one, that she could have scattered them, but she didn't. Each one was placed. Each one was a promise. Beside her, a child copied her, not perfectly, but the earth forgave crooked rows. It only asked for care. There were tools, yes, simple ones. A wooden hoe, a flint-bladed sickle. But more than tools, there was the body, bent forward, hands dirty, neck warm from the sun. The work did not hurry. It could not. The field would not be rushed. It asked the farmer to become part of its slowness, and the farmer agreed. They watched the skies, not with fear, but with curiosity. When the clouds came from the north, they nodded. When the wind turned warm, they waited. A single drop of rain was not enough, but it was a start. They didn't count days. They counted leaves. First, the sprout. Then, the whisper of green. Then, the stalk, thin but brave. Then, finally, the heads of grain, heavy with sleep, bending toward the earth that had held them. Harvest was not a festival. It was a return. They did not shout. They did not drum. They walked into the field with calm hands, cut the stalks, laid them in bundles. Children gathered the scraps. Goats followed, picking at what remained. The earth, once again bare, once again waiting, but not empty, because something remained after every season. Not just food, but memory. The field remembered the woman's footprints, the child's crooked planting, the song that rose when no one was watching. And the people remembered, too, the smell of wet dust, the shape of roots, the softness of wheat before the wind carried it away. When the grain was ground, the flour was shared, with the family, with the temple, with the traveler who knocked near dusk, and one asked how much had been grown. Only how much had been given. That was how worth was measured. The gods were pleased by offerings, but more so by gratitude, and the field, silent and wide, asked for only one thing: to be known. To be touched, and never taken for granted. The hands that wrote without sound in a room with no wind, no bells, and no birds. A boy sat alone. His hands were steady, his eyes quiet, and in front of him a soft square of clay. He did not speak. He did not hum. He only breathed. And with each breath, the stylus in his hand moved. One press, then another. Not carving, not cutting, just touching the clay until it remembered. This was writing. Before ink, before parchment, before paper flew in the wind. This was cuneiform, sharp and soft at once. pressed into tablets while the clay was wet, then left to dry in the sun. Words, made without sound. The boy learned slowly, from a teacher who said little. Each mark means something, the teacher whispered. But the space around it means just as much. So he learned to leave space, to let silence live between symbols. The tablet was no bigger than a hand, but inside it lived a contract, a promise, a name, sometimes a poem, sometimes a trade. I give you barley, you give me wool. But even simple words needed care, because once pressed, they stayed. The scribes did not shout. They were not priests, nor guards, nor kings. But they were trusted, to write what was true, and to keep it safe. Some carried tablets in satchels. Others stacked them in cool rooms, shelf by shelf. Each one is labeled, each one remembered. There were no mistakes. Or rather, there were mistakes. But there was no way to erase them, only to begin again, with a new tablet. So the scribes became careful. They wrote slowly, and they thought before they pressed. In the scribes' quarters near the temple, the windows were small. Light came in just enough to see, not to distract. They worked at low tables, sitting on mats. Their fingers always carried a bit of clay, under the nails, in the creases of the skin. It never quite washed away, and they didn't mind. A girl came to learn, the only daughter of a merchant. She wasn't supposed to, but her father asked. She remembers everything, he said. Let her learn to write it down. She sat in the corner, watched, listened. Then one day, when the teacher stepped out, she picked up the stylus. She pressed a single symbol. It was crooked, but clear. The others nodded. They did not scold. She had written. At night, the scribes read by oil lamp. Not aloud, just moving their eyes over the marks. They read about grain, about floods, about births. They read old names, faded ones, and sometimes they found their own father's handwriting, or their grandfather's, and they smiled, because time lived in clay, and silence held it together. The water that knew the way the water always knew where to go, even before the lines were drawn, even before the ditches were shaped. It moved without maps. It whispered its own language, and the people listened. They did not force it. They guided it, with care, with quiet hands. And the water answered. Before the sun rose, the canal keepers were already walking. Their feet knew every stone, every bend. They carried nothing but a stick and sometimes a reed map, soft with use. The canals were not deep, but there were many, curved like question marks, straight like promises. Some were wide enough for a boat. Some were no wider than a path for a child. But they all flowed, not with force, but with rhythm. A boy once asked his grandfather, "How do you know where to dig?" The old man smiled. "We don't dig first," he said. "We listen. The water tells us." So the boy sat by the edge, listened, watched a dragonfly skim the surface, watched the reed tips sway just slightly. And in that stillness, he heard the answer. Follow where it wants to go. Each village had its own schedule. One day, the water turned east. The next, it was allowed west. It was agreed, spoken between neighbors, marked with smooth stones at the gate. No one argued, because if you took too much, the field beyond would dry. And if that field dried, then so would yours. The water remembered. So the people did, too. In the hot season, small children stood barefoot in the water, letting it run between their toes. They learned its sound, its feel. A soft stream meant the gates were open. A strong push meant the weir was blocked. Even toddlers could tell. Even goats knew to drink when the sun hit a certain mark on the wall. Water was not a secret. It was a companion. At dusk, women walked to the edge with jars balanced on their heads. They didn't speak much, only enough to greet, to warn of a slippery stone, to compliment a child. Their feet found the same steps every evening, the path to the cleanest bend, and the water waited for them, cool, still, patient, like a friend who never left. Sometimes, they said, the water grew tired. It carried too much silt, too many broken branches. Then, the people gathered, not in alarm, but in care. They carried baskets, dragged rakes, and together, they cleared the bed. When they finished, they sat in the shade, shared flatbread, and listened as the water began to move again. Soft at first, then steady. The temple had its own channel, not wider, not grander, but lined with reeds, kept swept, and always flowing. Because offerings needed clean hands, and clean hands came from living water. Even the priests, with their robes and chants, knew water came before words. In one village, a child left a clay boat in the canal. It was made from a palm leaf and a broken stick. He placed it gently, watched it float, watched it disappear around the bend. "Where will it go?" his sister asked. "Everywhere," he said, and she believed him, because the water never truly ended. It flowed into fields, into mouths, into stories, and always came back. The threads that never broke before there were coins, before there were scrolls, before there were kings, there was cloth. Not as an ornament, not as wealthy, but as a necessity, and more than that, as memory. Because every thread carried more than fiber. It carried time. In the quiet rooms of the first villages, weaving was not work. It was rhythm. It began before the sun rose. A woman sat cross-legged on a mat. Beside her, a low loom, set close to the floor. She held the shuttle lightly, passed it through the threads, back and forth. The sound was soft, so soft that the birds did not stop singing, so soft that a baby sleeping nearby stirred but did not wake. Thread was not bought. It was made. From wool, from flax, from hair, from patience. A girl sat with her grandmother, watching as the older hands twisted fiber. Twist, pull, rest. Then again, twist, pull, rest. The spindle turned slowly, then fast, then slowly again. And the thread grew longer. Each spool was a small victory. Each thread a quiet story. Cloth was not for decoration. It was for life. To wrap a newborn. To cover a sleeping mat. To carry barley on the walk home. There was a cloth for the table, a cloth for the forehead when the sun was high, and a cloth folded beneath the cooking pot. And each one had a maker. Someone who knew where the wool came from. Someone who had watched it dry after rain. Someone who had spun it while singing. Even if the cloth was plain, it held hands within it. Patterns came later. Not for show. For memory. A row of triangles meant a wedding had happened. A stripe of blue meant a son had been born. Dots in the center meant someone had traveled far and come home again. Women shared these signs quietly. They didn't need to explain, only to nod, to smile, to pass the cloth from one lap to another. Sometimes, a woman wove in silence. Not because she was alone, but because her thoughts were enough. She remembered how her own mother once sat in this same spot, how her hands moved the same way. She wondered if her daughter, now old enough to fetch water alone, would one day sit here too, and the threads between them would never break. Even when the loom was taken apart, the cloth remained. Even when the weaver passed on, the fabric held her mark. A knot done her way, a twist only she used. Someone would notice, later, and they would know, she made this. In the marketplace, cloth was laid out on woven mats. It was touched gently, not handled roughly. Buyers didn't ask, how many threads? They asked, who wove this? Because that was the answer that mattered. Not the number, but the name. One man bought a length of cloth for his journey. He folded it into his satchel, used it as a pillow, wore it as a cloak, and when the wind was harsh, he wrapped it around his face. When he returned, the cloth was faded, but it was still whole. The weaver saw it, smiled. It held, she said, because thread made with care does not break. It stretches, it softens, but it does not break. The stone that was touched every day, it did not shine. It did not glitter. It was not carved into statues nor carried to temples. It was just a stone, but it was touched every single day. In the center of a kitchen, near the wall where the sun struck gently in the morning, sat a grinding stone, worn down by generations, smoothed not by water, but by hands. Round, heavy, unmoving, and beside it, a smaller stone, cylindrical, shaped perfectly for the palm. Together, they made flour. A woman rose with the birds. Not to pray, not to sow, to grind. She sat by the stone, took a handful of grain, scattered it like a blessing across the base. Then, with the smaller stone, she began. Back and forth, a sound like breathing. The stone made no complaint, and neither did she. Her mother had done this, and her mother's mother. No one taught them. The hands remembered on their own. Grip the top like this. Lean slightly forward. Let your elbow lead. Breathe when you press. Rest when the grains grow soft. It was a rhythm you entered, not a task you finished. Sometimes, a child would crawl near and place their hands on the edge. The woman would smile, reach down, and place the child's hands over hers. Back and forth, back and forth. A first lesson, not in cooking, but in patience. The flour was not white. It was golden, with bits of husk. It smelled like morning. It smelled like warmth. She scooped it into a bowl and covered it with cloth. And the stone sat quiet again, until the next hand arrived. In some homes, the grinding stone had a name. Not a loud one, just a nickname. Old Round. The keeper. My quiet friend. Because it never failed. It never left. Even when the house was empty. Even when the roof leaked. The stone stayed. At a wedding, the mother of the bride gave her daughter a bag of grain. Take the good bowl, she said, and remember the stone. It was not a gift, but a reminder that all beginnings start with bread, and all bread starts with labor, and love, and a little grain crushed between stones. Some men built their own grinding stones, carving them out of river rock. It took weeks, slow tapping, rubbing with sand, wetting the surface to check for smoothness. When finished, they placed it in the kitchen, and their wives thanked them, not with words, but with bread. When the woman grew older, she needed help. Her daughter came. Together, they grounded. The daughter spoke. The mother listened. Then one day, the daughter said nothing. She just sat alone and moved the stone back and forth. The sound filled the room, and the silence did not feel empty. It felt sacred. That stone never left. When the house crumbled, it was found by a boy who used it again. New hands, same motion. The same slow sound of care carried across centuries. The stone, touched every day, did not remember faces, but it remembered fingers, and the flour it helped make still smelled like morning. The house that faced the wind, it stood low to the ground. Not tall, not grand, but it never fell, because it faced the wind, and the wind was not an enemy. It was a visitor, a voice from the desert, returning each day with the sun. So the house was built to greet it, not to block it. Every home in the village was shaped the same way, not by rulers or architects, but by memory, by the hands of fathers, and the advice of mothers. The corners were round, the roofs were flat, and always, the door faced the breeze. Walls were made from mud brick, not wet clay, but earth mixed with straw, pressed into wooden molds, then left in the sun until they hardened, like bread cooling on a stone. They were stacked gently, one by one, with space left for light, for wind, for breath. There was no glass, only slits in the walls, not to look out of, but to let air pass through. The family placed jars filled with water near these slits so the air cooled as it passed. And even in summer, the home stayed kind. The door was low. You had to bow to enter. A reminder to be humble. A way to keep dust from sweeping in. Inside, the walls were smooth, coated with a thin layer of clay mixed with ashes. It smelled of earth, of warmth, of rest. In the main room, there was a stove, a low shelf, and a mat. That was enough. The mat was for sitting, for eating, for sleeping if needed. And on cool nights, when the wind grew bold, the family huddled there, wrapped in quiet, wrapped in cloth. Above them, the roof was not silent. It was made from beams, palm trunks, laid across, then covered in woven reeds, then a layer of packed mud. Each time it rained, the roof was repaired, not out of fear, but out of care, because a roof that lives with the sky must be tended gently. In the back, there was a small courtyard, not large, just enough space for a jug to sit in the shade, for herbs to grow in a clay pot, for a child to sit and hum, watching ants cross the cracks. Sometimes, a breeze came through the doorway and passed into the courtyard, then back out again. It did not ask permission. The house was built to let it pass. At night, the wind changed. It blew from the hills, cooler, softer, and the family slept, not in silence, but with the gentle song of wind slipping past clay walls, ruffling their dreams. There was a small niche in the wall, a place for the lamp. It was lit each evening, its flame protected from the wind's fingers. There, stories were told, bread was shared, and the house, low and round, listened quietly, holding everything it was given, not with pride, but with peace. The path that never closed. There was a path just beyond the house. Not paved, not straight, worn only by feet, by sandals, by bare soles, by the quiet movement of life going from one place to another without rush, without fanfare. The path was never announced, but everyone knew it. In the early light, when the clay still held the coolness of night, a man walked it with a jug on his shoulder. The jug was not new. It had a crack near the lip, but it held well enough. He walked without looking down. He knew every twist, every dip where rain once pooled. He walked toward the well, and the well waited. At mid-morning, a woman passed by the same path. Her arms held a bundle of herbs. The smell followed her, mint, anise, and a touch of dry sweetness from the earth. She walked slower, looking at the shrubs on the side. Some were blooming, some had gone dry. She picked a single flower and tucked it behind her ear. The wind touched her cheek. The sun touched her shoulder. The path touched nothing but remembered everything. At midday, a child ran barefoot over it. He carried a reed toy, half made, half broken. He didn't stay long on the path. He veered into a field, then back onto the path, then under the tree, then onto the stones. But the path did not mind. It was made for walking, but also for joy. The same path led to the river, to the temple, to the neighbor's house. It was not one road, but many. It changed depending on who walked it, and where they needed to go. In the heat, it shimmered faintly, not from gold, but from dust, soft and fine, lifted gently by passing feet. A potter carried his wares along it, balanced on a flat board resting on his head. He did not look tired. He had walked this path since he was a boy. Now, when he passed the bend near the olive tree, he could still hear his father's voice, soft and low, saying, "Not too fast." Pots break with pride. He never forgot, and the path never let him fall. In the evenings, a group of women walked it together. Their voices are low. Their laughter was quieter still. They wore woven shawls, not to impress, to keep the breeze from their necks. They spoke of things that did not need to be written down. What the baby ate, how long the grindstone turned, and how to soften clay with vinegar. The path listened, never interrupting. Even when no one walked on it, it kept its shape. Some said the path moved in time, not in space, because it led to memories more often than places. You might walk to the fig grove, but really, you were walking toward the smell of your grandmother's kitchen. You might walk to the canal, but really, you were following the sound of your brother laughing. Paths didn't end. They circled. They returned. They held footsteps and gave them back when needed. A dog once followed a boy to the edge of the village. The boy gave him half a flatbread, and they sat in the dust together. Years passed. The boy grew tall. The dog grew old. But every morning, the dog still walked the same path. Not to find food, just to remember. Because remembering is walking, and walking is remembering. After a long drought, the village held a gathering. They met on the wide part of the path, under the tamarisk trees. No one called it a meeting. They just came. Each family brought something. A pot of dates, a basket of onions, a cloth soaked in rose water. They sat on mats, spoke quietly, and the path held them all without complaint. It had done this for generations. It would do so again. Some children believed the path led to the stars. They said if you walked it far enough and did not stop and did not turn around, you would reach the place where stars rested during the day. No one stopped them from believing, because who could say it wasn't true? The path never said where it ended. It only said walk. The story that was never lost before the sun learned to rise at the same time. Before the river was given a name, there were stories. They were not written yet, not carved in clay, not painted on walls. They were spoken, whispered, wrapped in breath, told beside the fire, told under trees, told while grinding grain, while spinning thread, while watching stars blink in the quiet sky. One story said the world began in a bowl of water. Another said it was sung into being by a heron standing in the marsh. Some stories explained the moon. Others explained how barley first learned to grow. No one argued. They just listened, because the story itself was never wrong. It was only meant to be shared. In the cool hush of evening, a child would ask, "Tell me the one about the stone." And the grandfather would smile, settle into the mat, and begin. The same words, the same rhythm, as he had said them 100 times. The child already knew the ending, but still, he listened as if hearing it for the first time. Mothers told stories while their babies fed, stories without heroes, stories with rain that came at just the right moment. Sometimes, the stories were about real people, sometimes not, but it didn't matter, because truth was not the goal. Comfort was, connection was, and quiet understanding. The Potters had their own stories, told while shaping clay, soft talk, rounded words, like the vessels in their hands. They told of a bowl that never cracked, of a jug that carried sunlight, of a cup that remembered the lips of its maker. The pot wasn't special after that, but it was remembered, and that was enough. The weavers had their own tales, threads that unraveled unless a certain song was hummed, cloth that refused to tear until a baby was born. These weren't warnings. They were lullabies with meaning. They held the rhythm of work. They kept hands moving when the day was long. A man once forgot the beginning of a story. He paused, scratched his beard, and said, perhaps it started by the river, or maybe in a dream. No one minded, because the middle was strong and the ending was soft. It still made the children quiet. It still made the old ones smile. That was enough. Some stories were only told once a year, when the fig tree bloomed, when the first rains fell. These stories came with scent, with the season, and everyone knew them, not because they were taught, but because they were felt, like warmth, like the taste of honey. In time, some stories were written down, pressed into tablets with sticks, but writing did not replace speaking. It only reminded, because the true story lived in the voice, in the air between people. A clay tablet could crack, but a story, when told with care, would float through generations without needing ink. Some said that every story ever told was still moving through the world, that when the wind turned a certain way, if you closed your eyes, you could hear a piece of it, and if you listened carefully, you could add your own part and pass it on. Like bread shared across a mat, like water passed hand to hand. The story was never heavy, never too long. It just needed a voice, and a little time, and someone who believed it was worth telling. It began again, not with a grand discovery, not with a temple on earth or a statue raised to the sky. It began the way many stories do, with a footprint, pressed gently in the dust, just outside a home made of clay. A footprint facing forward, toward something quiet and new. The cradle had not stopped rocking. It had only paused, waiting for the next whisper to arrive. And now, someone had stepped forward. A girl, small but certain. She carried no scrolls, no keys to the past, just a basket and a question. She walked the path that curved along the edge of the village, past the oven that still held the scent of yesterday's bread, past the tree where pots were once traded and jokes were once told. The sky above her was soft and silver, not dark, not bright, just still, as if even the clouds were listening. In the basket, she carried a piece of string, a flat stone, a folded scrap of dyed cloth, and a figure. Each one meant something, though even she didn't know what yet. But she had been told, start walking. The story will meet you. So she did, step by step, toward the edge of what used to be. She passed an old well, its rope long since frayed, but its stones still cool. She sat for a while, just long enough to run her fingers along the moss at its rim. She didn't speak, but if she had, perhaps she would have said, I don't want to find the past. I want to know how it breathes. Then she stood and walked on. A few houses still stood, bare frames of what once was. Walls leaning gently, roofs open to the sky. Not ruins, just pauses, waiting for someone to notice they were still listening. She touched one wall with her palm and smiled. The clay was warm. She pressed her cheek to it, like one might lean against a sleeping friend. By mid-morning, she reached a grove where wild barley grew. Not planted, just present, like memory. The wind ran through it, and the stalks answered, swaying like threads on a forgotten loom. She dropped the fig into the soil, not because she had to, but because it felt right. Then she sat, listening to the wind, and tied the string around the stone. It didn't make a tool, or a toy, but it made a beginning, and that was enough. There, with her knees drawn up and the cloth scrap tucked into her sleeve, she rested. Not tired, just full, because the story had arrived. Not all at once, not in loud declarations, but in the way the air changed. In the way she knew, somewhere deep inside her chest, that someone long ago had sat in this very place, watching the same barley bend. And that was the story. The girl stayed in the barley grove until the shadows changed shape. The sun had moved. So had the clouds. But she had not. Because there are moments when stillness is not laziness. It is listening. She listened to the way the wind brushed the tops of the barley stalks. She listened to how the fig flies buzzed and how the ground gave a soft creak when she shifted her weight. She had not spoken a word since sunrise. And yet, it felt as if she had said 100 things. Not with her voice, but with her being. Around midday, she stood up. The stone tied with string hung from her wrist like a gentle anchor. She walked toward the place where the river curved in a wide, slow bend. This was not the main river, not the one that carried boats and trade. This was the quieter one, a side stream where birds liked to settle and reeds grew taller than a person's shoulders. It smelled of mud and water lilies. And old things, not rotten old, but remembered the old. She found a stone to sit on, flat, smooth, warm from the sun. She placed the folded cloth on her lap. It had once been part of a larger piece, a shawl, maybe, or a curtain near a grandmother's bed. But now it was only this piece, frayed at the edges, soft as breath. She ran her fingers across it and remembered what the old woman in the village had said. If you don't know what to say, you can always sit beside someone and let the silence say it for you. That was the softest kind of word, the word that wasn't said aloud. The word felt like wool and smelled like the corner of a room where bread cooled. Near the stream, she saw another child, a boy, about her age, wearing a tunic with one sleeve longer than the other. He had been gathering reeds, not for any reason he could explain, just because they were there. They did not greet each other. They did not need to. She handed him the cloth. He took it in silence. Then they sat side by side, watching the reeds move. There was no rush. No need to speak quickly. No need to impress. After some time, she pointed at a bird in the distance. A white heron, tall and still. It moved one leg slowly, then the other. She whispered, "Do you think it remembers where it came from?" The boy shrugged, then smiled. That was enough. Later, they both began weaving the reeds together. Neither of them had learned how, not properly, but their fingers knew more than they thought. Over under, over under. It made a sound like soft brushing. They didn't say what they were making. It didn't matter. It wasn't for keeping. It was for now. And now was everything. When the sun began to drop low, she untied the stone from her wrist and set it gently into the woven reed mat. The boy placed the cloth on top. They stood, not in farewell, but in stillness. Because parting, when it comes softly, is not sadness. It is trust that the path will cross again. And if it doesn't, that's all right too. She walked back toward the grove, but paused where the field met the dust road. There, she drew a circle in the dirt. Inside it, she pressed her hand, a print of her fingers, a mark of that moment. Then she stood and left it behind, not as something to claim, but as something to give. The softest words spoken are sometimes left behind. And if no one hears them, the earth will. And that is always enough. The field of forgetting she walked slowly. Not because she was tired, but because her feet liked the feeling of soft dust beneath them. It was warm now, not hot, just warm enough to make her eyelids heavier than before. Somewhere nearby, a heron let out a short, breathy cry. It didn't echo. It simply fell into the reeds and disappeared. She followed the path that turned east. Not the path she had come from. Not the one she had heard about. This one was made of footsteps barely pressed in. It was more suggestion than trial. Still, she followed it. Because sometimes we don't choose the path. Sometimes it chooses us. After a while, she came to a wide place in the land. It wasn't a field for farming. There were no crops. It was open, covered in low dry grass and stones that didn't seem to belong to any wall. The stones were shaped but broken. Some were smooth. Some were rough. One had a curved edge that seemed familiar, like a bowl, only too large for any hand to lift. This place had no name, but the girl could feel what it was. It was the place where things were left behind, where stories were put down, not lost, just left, the way one might leave a shell on a windowsill or a worn sandal near a stream. Things too heavy to carry, but too precious to throw away. A field of forgetting. Not forgetting as in lost memories, but forgetting as in letting go. She stepped carefully. At each stone she passed, she paused. Not to examine it, but to acknowledge it. Some stones had markings, symbols, lines that once meant something specific, but now it meant only that someone had cared enough to carve them. She knelt beside one, a flat stone with a shallow cup carved into its center. Maybe once it held oil, maybe once it held tears. Now, it held only the light of the sky, and that was enough. In the middle of the field, she saw a strange cluster of woven reeds. Not fresh, not made by her hands or the boys. Old, dry, sun-bleached, but still intact, still shaped with intent. She didn't touch it. She only sat beside it. She laid her stone bracelet on the ground, placed her palm over it, and closed her eyes. For a moment, she didn't think of anything. She simply was. Like the stone, like the field, like the sky overhead. Time passed, but not in a way that could be measured. There was no shadow to chase, no bell to chime, only the quiet sound of breeze in grass and a rhythm in her chest that told her, "You are here." And that is all that matters. When she opened her eyes, she noticed a folded scrap of parchment beside her, dry, slightly curled at the edges with faded ink. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. It wasn't a message. It was a presence, something someone had left not to be found, but to be honored. She folded it again, set it inside the hollow of a stone nearby, gently, with both hands. Then she stood, and as she did, her shadow joined those of the other things that had once been left behind. As she walked back toward the far edge of the field, she began humming. No words, just tone. It wasn't a song she knew, not one she had been taught, but it belonged there. It matched the field, soft, unfinished. When she looked back one final time, she noticed that the sun had turned everything golden. The stones, the grass, her footsteps. Even the air shimmered slightly, as if it too was remembering something and trying to let it go. The place where names sleep, she did not know what the place was called. But when she reached it, just as the last light folded itself behind the reeds, she knew what it felt like. It felt like the space between two words. It felt like the hush before someone speaks your name. It was quiet, not from silence, but from rest. And everything about the place felt as if it had been named once, long ago. But no one had spoken those names in many years. Not because they were forgotten, but because they had fallen gently asleep, like seeds under the soil, waiting for the right season to rise. She knelt at the edge of the place. The ground there was softer than it looked. Not muddy, not sandy, but a mix of clay and dust, old and deep. The kind of ground that remembered. She placed both palms flat and held them there. The warmth beneath her hands made her chest feel quiet, as if her heartbeat didn't need to knock, just whisper. There were no walls, no signs, only stones that stood upright and others that lay flat in rows. Some were round, some were thin, some had marks that had faded, and others had no marks at all. But still, she knew, this was where names came to rest. Not to vanish, but to wait. Not graves, not shrines, something in between. A field of stillness, where a name could curl up like a cat and sleep for 100 seasons. She walked among them, not quickly, not in search of anything, only to be near, only to let the quiet rise around her like dusk. She passed a circle of stones, arranged so carefully that the wind moved differently through them. It made a sound like soft humming, not music, but breathe. In the center of the circle was a bowl, shallow, smooth, carved from a single piece of river-worn stone. It held only rainwater, but in the dim light it shimmered like gold. She bent over it, saw her reflection, but it did not startle her. She had seen that face in dreams, and dreams were made of this same place, the place where names sleep. Her hand reached out. She touched the surface of the water, and the ripples moved outward slowly, as if they did not want to disturb anything too deeply. When the water settled again, there was no reflection, just sky, and the roundness of night is about to begin. She took a deep breath, then sat cross-legged beside the bowl. From her small pouch, she drew out a reed pen, the kind children used to learn how to write on clay. It had no ink, no tablet. Still, She held it like something sacred. She whispered a name, not her own, not one she had ever spoken aloud before, but one that rose up inside her like smoke from a still ember. She pressed the reed gently to the earth beside her, and even though no mark was made, she knew the name had been given, not to the ground, not to the sky, but to the stillness itself. And now, our journey comes to its end, not with a door closing, not with a page turning, but with the softest breath. A quiet stillness settles like dust in a place we've walked together for many nights. You have listened to the clay being shaped, to the barley bending, to footsteps barely heard, and to stories that have not been spoken in thousands of years. But you heard them. You heard them in the silence between words, in the calm way someone waited by a river, in the cloth folded beside a bowl, in the way a stone remembers a hand. This was never just a story about old walls, or broken tools, or vanished maps. This was always about people, soft-spoken, slow-moving, people who woke early to sweep the earth around their doorway, who carved their names not to be known, but to be remembered, people who found meaning in the space between tasks, in the hush before twilight, in the scent of grain ground finely between two stones. You have now sat beside their fire. You have traced their paths with your thoughts and seen through their eyes as they stared up at the first stars without needing to name them. And you, quiet listener, were never outside the story. You were always a part of it. Because the cradle never stopped rocking. It rocks still whenever you pause, breathe, and make room for the soft beauty of things left behind. The cradle of civilization was not made of stone. It was made of rhythm, of gesture, of kindness passed between hands, and of stories told not to be remembered but to be felt. You have felt them, and now, let them rest with you. Let them soften your thoughts. Let them slow your breath. Let them hold you the way the first earth held the first sleeping child. Tonight, you do not need to carry anything. Not memory, not history, not meaning. All you need to do is close your eyes and let the dust settle around everything we have seen. Let the barley grow tall again. Let the spindle stop. Let the names sleep. And in that stillness, may you rest too. Softly, quietly. And when you wake, know that the story will still be here. Because the oldest things never leave us. They just wait until we are ready to listen again. Sleep well, dear listener. And thank you for walking beside me.